Hey everyone, Chris here. Thanks for checking out the podcast. If you're enjoying it and learning something along with us, please consider becoming a supporting patron at patreon.com/ateacherhistory. Or you could leave a rating and review on iTunes. It would be a huge help. If you'd like to raise your hand and participate along with us, you can find us on Facebook, Twitter, @ateacherfist, or shoot me an email, chris@ateacherhistory.com. All right, let's get on to the next episode. Hello, welcome into A Teacher's History of the United States. Thanks so much for joining me again today. Did you know that Nicholas Biddle, by all accounts, worked really hard to not be political in his running and managing of the National Bank and tried everything he could, at least for a while, to avoid conflict with Andrew Jackson? And that President Jackson initially did not plan on going to battle politically over the bank. But the battle, one could argue, was taken to him. And that Jackson's veto of the Bank Free Charter infuriated his opponents, garnering him the nickname King Andrew and Andy Veto. Did you know all of this? Maybe, maybe not. Get your notebooks out because today we will cover that and more in episode 124, The Bank War. All right, everyone, welcome into episode 124. Real quick, book recommendation is The Bank War by Paul Kahan. It was written about 5 years ago. Really good. Check it out. Extremely detailed. If you are interested in what we're going to cover today and, a fairly long episode we're getting into today, then please check out The Bank War by Paul Kahan, Kahan. I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly. It is fantastic. I loved it. So, last week we dove deep into the nullification crisis. As you know, the nullification crisis was based on the concept of state sovereignty and the ability to veto a piece of federal legislation if the state deemed it to be unconstitutional. As we have covered, the precedent for this argument began during John Adams' presidency with the drafting of the Virginia and the Kentucky Revolutions. And while the argument was first established in 1798 and 1799, it didn't pick up too much momentum. And one of the primary reasons why was because the authors, Jefferson and Madison, remained anonymous. But the nullification crisis was different. While Calhoun tried his hand at anonymity, it didn't work. Word soon got out that he was the author of the South Carolina Exposition, pitting the vice president and the president against each other in a rare and unprecedented political feud that ended with Calhoun losing his position as vice president and beginning the end of his political career. As I've mentioned before, Jackson did not run from a fight, whether it was over nullification or the Petticoat Affair. Today, we're going to cover another fight that Jackson started and finished, but this time, instead of fighting with the state's right Southerners, he was going to turn his attention to the moneyed interest in the North and take on the National Bank of the United States. While the nullification crisis focused on the Tariff of 1828, the bigger argument that was driving the debate was the power of the federal government in relation to the states and the amount of authority and independence it was siphoning from the states. The debate on the national bank will feel similar in a lot of ways, except this time Jackson is not going to be publicly defending a creation of the federal government, but in fact he will be doing the opposite. And it will give us some insight into Jackson's perspective on the role of the federal government in the United States. While we talked last week about how he genuinely believed the federal government should be respected and powerful enough to provide for and defend the liberties and freedoms of the American people, which is why he viewed the nullification crisis as both a personal affront and undermining the nation's power, by the way, Jackson had a bit of a different view on the bank, though. As we will come to find, Jackson took personal issue with the bank. He believed the moneyed interest in the nation were controlling the financial fate of everyone through the creation of and control over the bank. And in retrospect, it is not particularly surprising that Andrew Jackson picked a fight over the bank. As we've covered, Jackson's election in 1828 was a referendum on the outcome of 1824, and an example of just how much the expansion of the vote and embracing of a more democratic electorate impacted American politics. With this new wave of democratic ideals and increased participation in the political process, Jackson was excited to ride this wave right up to the steps of the National Bank, using the popular support he had as the people's president to pick a fight with the moneyed interest in America and come out on the other end as the winner. The phrase, "to the victor go the spoils," is often used when describing Jackson's presidency, and well, he was the victor, and the opportunity to destroy the Bank of the United States became, one of his spoils. In 1831, French diplomat Alexis de Tocqueville was sent to the U.S. to study the American prison system. While they used that official business, studying the American prison system, as their justification for the trip, de Tocqueville and his partner were far more interested in studying American society, specifically the democratic revolution that had taken hold in the country and only seemed to be increasing its influence. Eventually, de Tocqueville will write an examination of this democratic revolution in his classic publication, Democracy in America, which I highly recommend you check out if interested. While he was visiting in the United States, de Tocqueville met with Nicholas Biddle, who at the time was the president of the Bank of the United States. De Tocqueville, in his previous meeting with other influential Americans, had expressed surprise at just how much democracy had taken hold in the U.S., and he couldn't understand why or how the ruling elite class that had so much control over the government 50 years earlier had seen their power slowly begin to slip away. For this Western European, it just didn't really make any sense. He also mentioned to Biddle that he didn't understand how the political parties in the U.S. were so ill-defined and lacked coherent and powerful political messaging. Biddle understood de Tocqueville's confusion and recognized that with the death of the Federalist Party, things had become a bit complicated, which allowed someone like General Andrew Jackson to rise to power. Biddle explained that since Jackson had taken power, quote, there had been people who support the administration and people who attack it, people who extol a measure and people who abuse it. But there are no parties properly so-called opposed one to the other and adopting a contrary political faith. The fact is that there are no two practicable ways of governing this people now, and political emotions have scope only over the details of this administration and not over its principles. After his time in America, de Tocqueville recognized that Biddle's description on the surface was an accurate one. But he also observed that while they may not be named and identified via political parties, the fight between the few and the many, or the wealthy and the not wealthy, still persisted. De Tocqueville pointed to the debate over the Bank of the U.S. as a perfect example of this persisting tension. He observed that it seemed that those who were educated and or wealthy were in support of the bank, and those who weren't were in support of the president. From his perspective, though, the bank was a great asset to the United States and provided stability and power to the nation. This stability, he surmised, might be one of the reasons why it was attacked in the first place. For during a time of democratic revolution, the most established and seemingly immovable aspects of the old world are often the ones attacked most fervently, which was a perspective, honestly, when I was reading about this, I'd never really thought about. Biddle agreed with de Tocqueville and thought the attacks on the Bank of the United States were both misguided and unnecessary. Nicholas Biddle had come from a plugged-in political family in Philadelphia, but through those experiences, he had initially decided not to pursue the partisan lifestyle of a politician. But after spending the early part of his career in literature, he was approached in 1819 by James Monroe, President James Monroe, to take a seat on the board of directors of the Bank of the United States. And when the president asks you to do something, for the most part, you do it. Biddle recognized how important the Bank of the United States was and how corrupt and ineffective its operation had become, at least from his perspective. By 1822, after 3 years of dedication to the reform of the bank, Biddle was nominated to become the president of the bank. Now keep in mind, while Biddle will be portrayed by his enemies as a partisan and in the pocket of big business, that certainly was not how he viewed himself, writing that the president of the bank, quote, should be known to and stand well with the government, not an active partisan, not even a party man, but a man in whom the government could confide. Since 1823, Biddle had worked extremely hard to try to clean up the errors of his predecessors, getting rid of corrupt officers, cleaning up messes, and tightening credit. In fact, Biddle also made a concerted effort to stay out of politics, not wanting the bank to be seen as the extension of any administration. With Biddle recalling in 1826 that, quote, I have been so anxious to keep the bank out of view of the political world and bring it down to its true business character as a counting house that I have been reluctant to apply to Congress for anything. While he was not able to totally remove himself from politics, he did seem to do an admirable job, with many of his closest friends not even knowing who he preferred to be president in the election of 1828. John Quincy Adams, by the way. In Biddle's mind, the bank was above politics, stating that, quote, we believe that the prosperity of the bank and its usefulness to the country depend on its being entirely free from the control of the officers of the government, a control fatal to every bank which it ever influenced. In order to preserve that independence, it must never connect itself with any administration and never become a partisan of any set of politicians. Biddle believed this, promoted it within the ranks of the officers of the bank, and was steadfast in his belief that all of his men were on the same page as he was. With this background on both Biddle and his role in the bank established, now we can move on to the emerging tension between Biddle's bank and President Jackson. As we covered in episode 122, Jackson's first formal address to Congress in 1829 called out the bank, and he stated he was determined not to renew its charter, or at least really heavily implied that Congress should consider whether it's constitutional in the first place, because, I don't really think it is. And then people were able to draw conclusions pretty simply from that. Biddle read the speech and was a bit concerned. But after meeting with Jackson and hearing his perspective, Biddle believed that Jackson's frustration with the banks was a personal perspective, not something he planned on formally adopting as president. Unfortunately for Biddle, he was wrong. Very, very wrong. With Jackson's first term plugging along and everyone aware of his enmity toward the bank, Henry Clay tried to use his political leverage and power to get out in front of the impending bank disaster. In 1830, Clay counted up the votes, and he believed he had enough to call for an early renewal of the bank's charter. So he wanted to bring it to the floor, propose a vote, and ruin Jackson's plan for non-renewal in 1832, the same year as his re-election. Now, Clay knew that it would pass in both houses of Congress, but there would still be one more obstacle prior to it being passed into law, and that is the signing of the bill by the president. Keep in mind, at this point in American history, the presidential veto was technically one of the powers of the president, but it was very rarely utilized. In fact, by the time Jackson will finish up his term, he will have used a veto more often than all the presidents before him combined. If Jackson were to veto the renewal of the bank charter, Clay knew that Jackson would be politically drawing his line in the sand with 2 years before his re-election campaign. Clay could not predict exactly how the American public would react, but he figured that if Jackson didn't veto it, it would be a huge win for the supporters of the bank. And if he did, he may be able to parlay that into a campaign against Jackson in 1832. Heck, from Clay's perspective, running on the issue of the bank was a more potent issue to run on than anything else he could think of. Now, knowing the outcome of all of this, we can see that this plan didn't work, but without the hindsight we have today, it could be considered a really good political strategy. Now, as you can imagine, Nicholas Biddle was not happy about this strategy. Biddle had worked very hard to keep the bank out of politics for the last decade plus, and he wasn't really in the mood to enter it into the political arena now, especially because it would be picking a fight with freaking Andrew Jackson. Biddle, though, was also concerned about the worst possible scenario he may end up facing, that they would vote to renew the bank. It get approved. Jackson vetoed it, and then also wins re-election. From Biddle's perspective, this is a nightmare. This would put the bank in an even worse position, with Jackson able to argue that his re-election in 1832 was some type of referendum on not rechartering the bank, and proved the people supported its destruction, whether it did or not. This worst-case scenario kept Biddle hesitant at first to get on board with Clay's plan. But Jackson's address to Congress in 1830, reiterating his desire to weaken the bank, made Biddle begin to reconsider. Biddle had hoped that over time and with more experience in office, Jackson would soften his stance on the bank. But after Jackson made it very clear publicly, again, that he desired to disempower the bank, Biddle figured it made sense to take the fight to Jackson's administration, and he genuinely believes the people would be behind him. With both sides willing to fight over this issue, Biddle and Clay began to scheme how they were going to try to be successful. Biddle reached out to numerous newspapers across the country, hoping to begin to lay down the foundation for a propaganda campaign in support of the bank that would put public pressure on Andrew Jackson to allow for its renewal. Now, just because Biddle and Clay were mounting this fight doesn't mean either one felt good about it. Biddle recognized that Jackson believed pretty strongly, and for good reason, that he was going to win re-election. Biddle was afraid of that worst-case scenario, that Jackson would win re-election, it would be a referendum on his stance on the bank, and that would be the end of the bank. Biddle also was afraid that if Jackson was so confident in his re-election one way or another, he would likely be more willing to veto the bill, leading to that potentially worst-case scenario. Biddle figured if Jackson had any doubts about winning the election, he may consider not vetoing it because it would be so unpopular with so many people. But if he believed wholeheartedly he was going to win re-election, then who cares? Clay understood Biddle's concern, but wasn't convinced that Jackson would veto the bill. If he was re-elected, though, he was sure he would. Also, another factor was that Clay knew how popular and beloved Andrew Jackson was, and the bank issue to Clay, and when you think about it, it made sense, was really the only chance anyone had to make him unpopular and potentially remove him from power. So with Clay's urging, Biddle decided to apply for an early renewal of the charter. But Biddle was sure to make it very clear that this was not a political move and had nothing to do with politics at all, stating that, quote, "Neither I nor any of my associates have anything whatever to do with the president or his election. I know nothing about it, and I care nothing about it. The bank has never had any concern in elections. It will not have any now." Now, whether Biddle 100% actually believed what he said or not, he was hoping to make it very clear that this was not purely a political move. And by doing that, he would be able to put pressure on Jackson not to veto it. He figured if he made it clear that he was not being political, and he had a track record to validate those statements, right? He had been saying this for a decade, that if Jackson vetoed it, it would be a naked political maneuver, one that would lose him support. Biddle figured that if Jackson took this risk into account, he would maybe be less likely to veto it. After Biddle put the renewal bill to the floor of Congress, he received a lot of positive feedback and even heard rumors that if he didn't push for it, other senators were going to. With that, Biddle had a jolted sense of confidence, even musing that, quote, "If the bill passes and the president negatives it, I will not say that it will destroy him, but I certainly think it will. And moreover, I think it ought to." And before we get into the details of how this bank rechartering turned out, I think it's valuable to keep in mind that just like the nullification debate, the debate over the bank had a broader perspective of the role of the federal government that was simultaneously being debated. The pro-bank and anti-bank crowd saw themselves fighting either for or against this political shift toward a more democratically represented electorate. Democracy was a buzzword at this time, and for all intents and purposes, this debate over the bank was a debate over the merits and value of this new American democracy. Daniel Webster, unsurprisingly, defended the bank on the Senate floor. He argued that getting rid of the bank could be disastrous, would lead to a, quote, disordered currency. The paper money that would be printed from the state banks would be, quote, flimsy money, and would hurt the average man more than anyone else. It would open up opportunities for corruption and graft. Lastly, if this paper money became more prevalent, the value of gold and silver, that would drop, and the circulation of it would decrease also. Now, you may be thinking, wasn't the Bank of the United States printing money too? Couldn't you just, basically take his argument and use it against him? Sort of? Well, yeah, you could. But Webster would contend that at least it is in a centralized location and had oversight from Congress. And the money that was printed was backed up by gold and silver. These state banks, or wildcat banks, as their opponents derogatorily nicknamed them, would not have such oversight. The strongest opponent to the bank was Thomas Benton from Missouri. He thought everything about not just the practice of the bank, but even its existence was unacceptable and unconstitutional. Benton argued that the bank was, quote, wrong in law, wrong in policy, wrong in politics, and wrong in morals. Benton continued that the creation of it was unconstitutional in the first place. Not only that, but the policies and location of the bank, in Philadelphia, were clearly favoring the East, specifically the Northeast, while directly and indirectly hurting the West and the South. Since these bankers and businessmen continued to squeeze money out of the bank and recirculate it to the Northeast, there were many honorable, hardworking Americans in the West and South that would have debts coming due that wouldn't be able to pay them off. Shame on the bank and its bankers. Benton explained that, and I really love this quote, listen carefully, it's a little long, but Benton explained that, quote, when that dread day comes, the towns and cities of the South and the West, the fairest farms and goodliest mansions will be set up at auction to be knocked down to the bank agent at the mock prices, fixed in the counting room of the bank itself. And from this would spring what had been implicit in the bank from the start. In these mock sales of towns and cities may be laid the foundation for the titles and estates of our future nobility, Duke of Cincinnati, Earl of Lexington, Marquis of Nashville, Count of St. Louis, Prince of New Orleans. Such may be the titles of the bank nobility, to whom the next generation of American farmers must crook the pregnant hinges of the knee. Yes, sir, when the renewed charter is brought to us, to vote upon, I shall consider myself as voting upon a bill for the establishment of lords and commons in this America, and for the eventual establishment of a king. And when the lords and commons are established, the king will come of himself. Both men and their allies put up good arguments for their support of the bank in opposition to it. But don't think it was all altruistic sacrifice for the average man. Many of the loudest voices in this debate, including both Webster and Benton, had a personal interest. Webster was actually an attorney who was getting paid to represent the bank, legally, like he was on retainer. And many of his allies were directly or indirectly profiting off of the bank. On the other hand, many of the most vocal opponents of the bank found themselves in similar situations, often having allied themselves with a state bank that they knew would provide them with more friendly terms or lucrative opportunities than the national bank did. In the end, it's all about the Benjamins. Now, the one challenge the supporters of the bank had was that, well, they were defending bankers. I mean, who gets excited about that? Do banks help the economy? Yeah, 100%. Are they necessary? Sure. Do really honest and smart bankers provide value to the nation and individuals? Yes, they do. But are people excited about defending this value in public? No. For like lawyers. But could people get excited about talking about how corrupt, duplicitous, and selfish bankers were? Heck yes, they could. And look, Biddle wasn't helping himself here. In fact, there was one congressman who was initially opposed to the bank, and the bank's renewal. And then he got a loan from the bank with really good terms. And all of a sudden, he was in support of the renewal. I mean, come on, guys. Sometimes I just really hate politics. Now, we've covered the background on Biddle and his stance on the bank and why he was taking this fight to Jackson. Then we talked about the different arguments back and forth. Now let's talk about Andrew Jackson and how he felt about all this nonsense. To be fair to Jackson, he did not plan on campaigning over the bank issue, and this was not a fight he had asked for. At least that's what he believed, and that's what he said. One could easily make this counter-argument that, in fact, yes, you did ask for it when you publicly declared multiple times that you didn't like the bank and didn't plan on supporting the renewal of the charter. But that's neither here nor there. If Jackson doesn't actually believe that, then it really doesn't matter. Because the fact of the matter is that when Jackson entered the White House, he didn't plan on fighting the bank. It wasn't until rumors started to circulate that the Bank of the United States supported John Quincy Adams in the election of 1828 did Jackson really consider taking on this fight. The rumors were that supporters of Adams were more likely to get loans and more likely to get hired by the bank than those that supported Jackson. But while Jackson believed privately that he did not plan on fighting about the bank and making it a central issue in his reelection, he definitely wasn't going to not fight about it. I mean, this is Andrew Jackson we're talking about. He does not back down from a fight. So with the bank's renewal bill passing in Congress, it was handed over to Jackson for his signature. And he probably just reveled in the opportunity to piss a lot of people off. As you likely assumed, Jackson vetoed the bill with a resounding message back to Congress. He began by explaining that, quote, a Bank of the United States is in many respects convenient for the government and useful to the people. You may be somewhat surprised by this initial contention. But keep in mind that while Jackson didn't like the bank, he did recognize the value it brought. He wasn't just like full-bore anti-bank. Additionally, to him, this wasn't a big enough problem to pick a fight over, but it was a big enough problem to win a fight over. In the end, Jackson still believed in his heart that the establishment of the bank in the first place was unconstitutional. When considering the arguments his opponents posed regarding its constitutionality, Jackson replied, quote, to this conclusion I cannot assent. Mere precedent is a dangerous source of authority and should not be regarded as deciding questions of constitutional power except for the acquiescence of the people, and the states can be considered as well settled. And Jackson does have a pretty good point here. While it was technically deemed constitutional in McCulloch v. Maryland, Jackson was unconvinced. If you remember, the bank was initially chartered in 1791, and then it was allowed to expire 20 years later in 1811. It took 5 years of debate and political wrangling to recharter it in 1816, and one of the primary reasons it was ever rechartered in the first place was because of the War of 1812 and the need to organize and allocate finances. Remember when we talked about judicial review? The power of the Supreme Court to have the final word on the constitutionality of an act of Congress or the executive? Well, that was established indirectly, if you don't remember, through Marbury versus Madison in 1803. And while it's clearly the way things work now, back then not everyone believed that, including President Jackson. And the Supreme Court really didn't have the leverage to do much about it. This finality the Supreme Court decisions carry in today's society just didn't exist back in the 1830s. Jackson couldn't reason why an opinion of the Supreme Court should carry more weight than the decision of actual elected representatives in Congress or him, the president. But it wasn't just a constitutional argument that Jackson relied upon. He was genuinely afraid of the potential monopoly of America's finances. How is the country supposed to operate freely and independently if the bank held this much power? Because if this were to be the case, the public's interest would never be the priority, but instead the priorities of the bankers and the stockholders would take precedent. Jackson explained that, quote, it is easy to conceive the great evils to our country and its institutions might flow from such a concentration of power in the hands of a few men irresponsible to the people. Jackson concluded the justification by explaining that, quote, there are no necessary evils in government. Its evils exist only in its abuses. if it would confine itself to equal protection, and as heaven does its rains, showers its favor alike on the high and the low, the rich and the poor, it would be an unqualified blessing. But of course, from Jackson's perspective, the bank did not do that. As I've mentioned before, vetoes were very rare prior to Jackson's presidency. In fact, the 6 presidents prior to Jackson had only used a veto 10 times. Jackson, he had more than that all by himself. But while Jackson had gotten some pushback from his previous vetoes, the veto of the bank brought about a whole new level of outrage. Henry Clay was beside himself and declared the bank veto a, quote, vestige of royalty. Daniel Webster said that it was a, quote, fearful and appalling aspect of the power Jackson claimed for himself. With the financial future of the nation totally up in the air, people were freaking out. Some people. Some businesses were brought to a standstill all over the country while they waited to see what the results would be and how things would shake out. There were protests outside the bank in Philadelphia, with some activists believing that Jackson had seized far more power than was appropriate and, quote, trampled on the citizens and constitution of the country. And while this decision from Jackson did cost him some votes, in the end, he was still incredibly popular. He was so popular prior to the veto that he was able to politically withstand the outrage many of the pro-bank crowd lobbed his way. Jackson's supporters, recognizing that the veto wasn't popular, leaned into it anyway, declaring that the veto only reinforced how he was the defender of the common man, exactly what they thought he would be when they elected him in the first place. Andrew Jackson is fulfilling his promises. And I mean, there were a lot of fans of Jackson who wholeheartedly supported his decision to not recharter the bank. Because while there were protests in Philadelphia publicly declaring their frustrations with his decision, there was also a parade that was reportedly a mile long, praising him for defending the common man. Jackson will take this momentum into the election of 1832 and see himself get reelected and treated like a rock star all over again. But we have a couple more things to cover before we get to the election of 1832. And when we get into Jackson's second term, we'll be able to examine more closely the consequences of his decision, not to recharter the bank. Next week, Zach Woods will be back on the podcast after a long hiatus to chat in detail with me about the third fight Jackson picked in his first term in office, the Indian Removal Act. Thanks for listening, and hopefully now you can take pride in knowing just a little bit more about the history of the United States. Class dismissed.